Thank you, Dan. Yeah, so regulatory and reimbursement basics, most exciting talk of SAGES, right? My goal is to make this as entertaining as possible and hopefully memorable for you. As Dan mentioned, I have a background in engineering and art. I work at a French medical robotics startup called Moon Surgical. I have 9 years in the industry, and I've been involved in 5 different regulatory submissions, which probably doesn't sound like a lot to you, but hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better appreciation for how long they take. And I'm a clinical development manager. So first of all, as Ashley mentioned, this is kind of an impossible task to combine really heavy topics into one. Regulatory and reimbursement are quite separate concepts, so I'm going to be talking about them separately. I'll cover why you should care, how you determine which regulatory pathway is appropriate for your new technology, what you can expect when you interact with the FDA, because it is actually very interactive of a process. And then reimbursement, honestly, I'm going to speed through that because there is a lot to get through, but the major stakeholders and how to get a new code, if that's something you're looking for, are topics I'll cover. And then finally, I'll conclude with some of their interdependencies. Oh, and this is a talk that's focused on the US, so if you are looking into European markets, definitely take a look into those requirements. So as I was thinking about the right way to kind of frame how regulatory and reimbursement fit into this really big ecosystem and the process, I'm going to draw from a really famous and popular story, internationally famous, and also very helpful for passing the time for those long flights between California and France. It's an unlikely but uncanny analogy, and that's Harry Potter. So the best analogy within Harry Potter for regulatory is Professor Dolores Umbridge. Hopefully you guys are familiar with this story. If not, I'm sorry. So Professor Dolores Umbridge, she publishes a lot of rules. And just like the FDA, her objective is to make sure that the public does not get harmed. In her case, from magic. In our case, of course, from medical devices and drugs. So their aim is, to ensure that devices are safe, and in some cases, safe and effective. Without regulations, previously manufacturers could market devices without proving their claims and without enough testing. There are some pretty famous cases that they investigated in the early 1950s. The drug thalidomide was prescribed to women who were pregnant, ended up causing a lot of birth defects. There's a very important reason why the FDA exists, and they're a huge part of our ecosystem. Some could argue, though, that the regulatory process in the US can hinder innovation, but regardless, the FDA and Professor Umbridge are between you and saving or improving lives with your new technology. So we'll get familiar with those rules. The next is reimbursement, totally different ballpark. No pun intended. I liken it to the golden snitch. It's something that is evasive, kind of hard to get your hands on, but everyone is after it because at the end, it's going to come into play. So it ensures that you're going to have widespread adoption, and it's going to make it easier in the end for you to be a commercial success. So let's get into it. So when we talk about regulatory, I think one of the most common questions that comes up for an early entrepreneur is, so what's your regulatory pathway? That's actually just like a really weird way of saying, what submission are you going to submit to the FDA? And so I'll talk about how you can answer that question. Sure, some of you or all of you have heard of a 510K. It's not a fancy retirement account. It's actually a type of submission that you send to the FDA if you have a new device. And so it's a type of regulatory pathway. The other two that I'm going to cover in this talk are a pre-market application, or PMA, and For all the other stuff that didn't fit into these two pathways, the FDA came up with a new pathway, and they call it the de novo pathway. So in order to understand which pathway your technology is going to flow, you need to understand what the risk classification of your device is. So if you got classes 1 through 3, they're ranked in order of increasing risk to the user. I think the best way to understand this concept is actually to go through some examples. So I am gonna have to ask you guys to think a little bit, come up with some ideas, but I will try to remember the exact definitions of the classes, and you guys can shout out some devices. And if you're really lost, or if you're a hardcore Harry Potter nerd, you can shout out a spell. All right, so class 1, I believe this is devices that present minimal potential for risk to the user. Very helpful definition. Anyone? Yes, great, okay. So we've got bandages, elastic bandages, Q-tips, tongue depressors, things like that. Expelliarmus, which is just disarming your opponent, no harm done. All right, class 2, oops, sorry, give it away. So class 2 is kind of defined by what it's not. It's not class 1, it's not class 3, so it's moderate to kind of high risk. And they're not life-saving devices, they don't support life, they're not implantable. And this is kind of encompasses the majority. I did give it away, so you can shout it out. Yeah, great, okay. X-ray machines, things like disposable contact lenses, etc. Petrificus totalis, that's just a stunning spell. You know, it could potentially cause some harm if they fall, or if they stay stunned. All right, let's move on to class 3. So, oh shoot, I keep doing that. These are the class of devices that pose the most risk. It's implantable devices, devices that sustain life, or that pose, I believe it's unreasonable risk to the user. So prosthetic heart valves fall into this class, breast implants, implantable pacemakers, etc. All right, so, and Avada Kedavra, that's, I hope you know what that is. And then finally, there is an entire list of devices that are exempt because they are so low risk to the user, things like bedpans, stethoscopes, etc. Okay, so if that wasn't perfectly clarifying as to which pathway your technology is going to go down, you can go onto the FDA's website and open up the database that shows all devices that were ever cleared or approved by the FDA. Let's just say you have a great idea for a new laparoscopic trocar. You can type in that name. You'll come up with 500 different devices. I selected one, and you can take a look at the device class for that existing device. And this is an important exercise to go through anyways, because it helps you identify a predicate, which I'll get into now. So we saw that some class 1 devices are completely exempt from this regulatory pathway business. Then the majority of class 1 and 2 products go through the 510K pathway, and then class 3 go through the PMA pathway. There are some exceptions, but in general, the difference is that you're required to include more controls in the design of the product, and there's a lot more kind of requirements in the application itself for a PMA. And specifically, we talked about predicate, but for a 510K, you have to make sure that the device that you're hoping for clearance or approval on has a predicate it's substantially equivalent to. Substantially equivalent is like, it means essentially that the intended use of the device is the same as the predicate. It's also the same technology or equivalent risk level technology. And then for class 3 devices, regardless of whether there's a predicate on the market, you always have to go through the PMA process. And then if you are in this unique space where you have a class 1 or 2, so low to moderate risk device, that doesn't have an existing predicate, then you go through the de novo pathway. I want to demystify what it is like to actually interact with the FDA. Sometimes they're vilified, but in the end, they are a review team of people. So you are going to get assigned a team of reviewers with a lead reviewer. And there's a few different interactions you can kind of have. I'm going to be drawing from the latest 2024 pricing for fees. And one of the optional interactive requests that you can make is a 510G. So if you're still confused about which class device you have, you can actually ask them. You just have to pay for it. And then one of the interactions that I highly recommend being very prepared for is a pre-sub. It's a pre-submission meeting. So prior to submitting a 510K or a PMA, you can actually request to talk to the FDA, run your ideas by them. It's essential for making sure that you've got the right predicate device. It saves a lot of time. You can review protocols for your clinical testing, your bench testing, your cybersecurity, whatever it is. And then going down the pathway for a 510K, again, these are all small business fees. For larger businesses, it's 2 or 3 times this amount. But day 1, they get the application. They'll send you an acknowledgement letter on day 7. And then by day 60, they will start an interactive review, which is essentially sending you a bunch of questions about the testing that's been done and maybe asking for additional data. And then you just have another 30 days to respond to them and get that data back until there's a final decision that's made. For a PMA, as you can see, it's a lot more expensive and it's a much longer review process. So again, you get an acknowledgement letter, and then by day 100, that's when you can schedule an optional review meeting, and then you'll get a final decision by day 180. And I also want to kind of add a little hint here. So when you talk about getting a successful 510K or PMA submission, you should say that you have a cleared or you've gained clearance if you have submitted a 510K, and you've gained approval or you have an approved device if you've submitted a PMA. Just kind of, that will indicate to people that you know what you're talking about. All right, so finally, reimbursement. Again, this comes into play later on. And there are 3 major stakeholders that you need to be aware of in reimbursement. There are government agencies that control the lists of the codes that can be used when you have a novel device or if you're trying to get expanded reimbursement. You got coverage, so these are the payers. They're government or private payers. And we've got payment, so the government agencies who decide who and how much who gets paid and how much they get, so facilities and physicians. I don't have any cute reasons why I use these characters. They're just memorable. So really quickly here, for coding, for inpatient procedures, you've got a list of ICD-10 codes. I think you probably all are more familiar with coding than I am. But this is actually something that's governed by 2 agencies, the CDC and CMS. They create a committee that has both members. You have to submit your kind of your proposal for a new code to them prior to their meeting. And then you have to specify exactly why existing codes don't capture the procedure. For outpatient procedures, codes are owned by the AMA, American Medical Association. You've got level 1, those are CPT codes, level 2, and you have to submit an application to the AMA if you're looking to add a new code or expand the definition of a code, but it has to be done through a professional society. So you have to have already won over a relevant professional society. And some of the requirements that you need for that review process are already FDA clearance or approval for all the technologies that are involved in that procedure. You'll need to show widespread use according to the clinical indications. And you have to have published and demonstrated efficacy to the level that the AMA requires. So this is not a short process. This is a long game. You should have thought about, do I need reimbursement? Do I need to plan for this? And it's really a long-term plan. That obviously takes a long time. You have some alternatives while you're waiting it out. You can apply for a Category 3 CPT code, which is a temporary code, or you can use a miscellaneous code because, it's like chicken or the egg. How are you supposed to get widespread usage if you don't have a code and people can't get paid for it? So the way around this is through Category 3 and through miscellaneous codes. For coverage, you're looking for payers to adopt your new technology into their coverage policy or to determine that it's medically necessary for their enrollees. This review process also has a lot of steps and also requires planning in advance. So you have to have already had a cleared or approved product. You need to show non-inferiority or superiority to the current solutions. You already have to have evidence that it's real-world favorable outcomes. You have to have published in a high-impact journal. You need to have clinical practice guidelines published, et cetera. So this, again, is a long process. Okay, and then finally, payment. So payment is also split. So it's regulated by CMS through MSDRG codes. What you can do is apply for a new technology add-on payment, or you can apply for a new MSDRG code. You have to show that your concept is novel. You have to show positive outcomes, and then you also have to show that it's currently expensive to do the procedure and it requires additional payment. And then finally, CMS also has a system, the ambulatory payment classification system. And what you can do there is seek pass-through payment, pursue a new technology APC, or seek reclassification. Okay, so clearly there are some interdependencies between regulatory and reimbursement. Essentially, you need to have a regulatory strategy in place, and you need to have gotten through clearance or approval in the US in order to really get the gains from reimbursement. There isn't a lot that's required of regulatory from reimbursement. That's everything from me. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me later.